Hello, and welcome to a Sunny Book Nook. Today I'm going to be wrapping up all the books that I read in the month of June. June was not a great reading month. I only read 17 books, which is kind of a marked decline from the past couple months of my reading, but I think that's still a pretty hefty stack of books, and I got to some poetry collections, some nonfiction, and it generally I read some really good stuff. Let's see how my star rating statistics situation went. I had 6 3-star ratings, 6 4-star ratings, and 5 5-star ratings. So generally a really good in terms of the actual books I picked up reading month. Let's get into it. The first book that I read in the month of June was Abhorsen, which is the third book in the Abhorsen series by Garth Nix. I gave this book 3 stars, mostly because I think this entire series is a 3-4 star kind of series, and I didn't really like this book as much as the previous ones. I didn't find the characters as compelling, and I really just picked it up because I needed some escapism into a fantasy world I was already familiar with, so it served my purpose for that, but it's not like a phenomenal sequel in my opinion. Next book that I read was Heads of the Colored People by Nafissa Spires Thompson, and I talked about this book in my mid-year book freakout tag as one of my favorite books of the year so far, and it definitely is. It's kind of a collection of interlocking short stories about different people. We jump from the perspectives of different characters, and they're all Black people who are in different walks of life and have different experiences. Like, we jump into the heads of this girl who's an ASM artist, into the head of someone who's a cosplayer, and it explores the themes of race and brutality and police brutality and violence and gender and all of that, like, thematically, but it also is like just a meditation on how human people are. And I just really think it was a really beautiful and poignant book, and I rated it 5 stars. The next book that I read was a poetry collection called The Tradition by Jericho Brown, and I rated this book 3 stars. I thought that the poetry kind of went over my head because I'm not a poet, so I didn't quite grasp everything, but Jericho Brown is a Black HIV positive gay man, and his poetry explores all of that, and I think it won the Pulitzer or something, some major literary prize, and the cover art is beautiful, but I just didn't really connect with the language as much as other poetry collections I've read. This book that I read in the month of June was Sister Outsider, Essays and Speeches by Audre Lorde, and I rated this book 5 stars, obviously. This book is like a seminal Black feminist text, and I would encourage everyone to read it. I think it does a really good job at criticizing feminism as like a popular movement and criticizing white feminists, and also criticizing and analyzing the history of white womanhood. I hate to use the word intersectionality because I think it gets thrown around a lot without people knowing what it means, but it really does examine the intersectionality of race, gender, class, sexuality, so many things. And Audre Lorde is a brilliant thinker and writer and speaker, so I would really encourage you to pick this up. The next book that I read was Homie by Danette Smith, which was a 4-star read for me. I thought that a lot of the poems in here were really compelling. Danette Smith, they're a great writer. The next book that I read was The City We Became by N.K. Jemisin, which I rated 4 stars. I thought this book was really, really interesting. The kind of plot dynamic and the idea that cities are manifested as people, and they can be like born and they can die, and they're impacted by thousands and millions of multiple dimensions layered on top of each other. It's just so fascinating to me, and I thought that N.K. Jemisin did such an interesting job at weaving in the elements of race and gender and like criticisms of, you know, gentrification and how cities are manipulated by larger forces at hand. She does it all in such a interesting and like fantastical way. So I really enjoyed this book. I thought, however, that I didn't really understand quite what was going on until 50 to 70% of the way through this book, which I think is a pretty consistent theme in most of N.K. Jemisin's work. Like, her books kind of build up into something, and I know a lot of people actually didn't like this book, interesting enough, because I think Jemisin's delving into like a more urban fantasy kind of vibe. It is, I guess, not what people might have expected, but I thought that she did a good job, and I thought this book was really interesting, and I think that if you're a New Yorker especially, you would really, really, really appreciate this book. The next book that I read was Stamped from the Beginning, The Definitive History of Racist Ideas in America by Ibram X. Kendi, and I have a physical copy because I ordered it online and I hauled it in my most recent haul video. And this book, 5 out of 5 stars, 100%. So good, so informative. Obviously it's huge, but like it's so full of really interesting and like grotesque primary sources that are analyzed in such a comprehensive way. And I think Dr. Kendi does such a good job at pulling that racist history and linking it to systems of power and oppression, and how racism as an idea and as a functioning aspect of our society isn't a constant. Like, it's not a societal constant. It is manufactured, and it is manufactured to maintain a hierarchical system of power. I highly encourage everyone to read this, and especially if you're interested in history or if you're interested in learning more about race and anti-racism. The next book that I read was Don't Call Us Dead by Danez Smith, which is Danez Smith's first poetry collection, and I rated this 5 out of 5 stars. Some of the poems in there really were so deeply moving. The other book that I read, which I accidentally skipped over between Stamped from the Beginning and Don't Call Us Dead, is Sula by Toni Morrison. This is a pretty slim novel, and I thought this was beautiful. I read Beloved, and I've read The Bluest Eye, so I'm just slowly working through Toni Morrison's work. And this was such an interesting tale, and I think Toni Morrison's way of weaving magical realism into all of her books, and that like grotesque kind of horror in that like Midwestern Gothic vibe that she creates, and these characters that feel so real and fully fleshed and human. It's all encapsulated in this book, which I rated 4 out of 5 stars. The next book that I read was Citizen by Claudia Rankine. I also hauled this in my last haul video, but I thought that this book was so interesting, and I need to reread it because I listened to it on audiobook, and it's actually like an art book basically, and I think that the storytelling format is just so interesting because it's like different meditations on pop culture, and it's very poetic, but it's also really rooted in current events, like a meditation on race and racism. There's a whole section about like Serena Williams and how she was treated, and there's sections that are just reflecting and like almost like reviewing other kind of art pieces, and the kind of like format is just very, very like loose almost, and yeah, I just really want to read this with my eyes to see how Claudia Rankine utilizes space to convey her like inner thoughts and feelings. The next book that I read was The Poppy War by R.F. Kuang. I rated this book 3 out of 5 stars. I thought that it was a really interesting fantasy. I also hesitate to call it fantasy because it also feels so much like historical fiction, and it gave me so much rage against Imperial Japan. Like, I was so angry. There's that, but I thought the plot pacing was just kind of off and weird, and it was so dark and heavy, and I felt like I was just trudging through so many dark things, and it wasn't that enjoyable for me, to be honest. I think it's well written, and I think it's good, and I think the main character is interesting, but also like a lot of the decisions that she makes and a lot of the things that happen to her just don't really I didn't really feel that compelled, because a lot of times it would be like, your teacher just said to not do that, and now you're doing it, and now you're dealing with the consequences of it, and like, of course it's not going well for you. Like, I as a reader knew that it wasn't going to go well, so I don't know why I've spent several chapters seeing you deal with the consequences of not listening to your teacher or whatever. I don't know. I just found it irritating in that way. So the next book that I read was Women, Race, and Class by Angela Davis. I gave this book 5 out of 5 stars, obviously. I think that this book does a very, very, very good job at also analyzing those intersections of like women, race, and class. It's a brilliant book, and I think you should read it. The next book that I read was The Vanishing Half by BRIT Bennett. This book was phenomenal. I thought that the concept was so interesting. It really like morphed so many elements that I love in stories and books, like generational stories, different perspectives that are all kind of linked together. I'm sure you've heard of this book already because it's been getting a lot of hype, but it's basically about 2 sisters who grow up in this town that is basically all very light-skinned Black people, and they both like escape town and they leave when they're 16, and one teenager kind of assimilates into whiteness and becomes basically like a trophy wife, and another one marries a really, really dark man and has a child, and comes back to town and is now looking for her sister whom she hasn't seen in like over a decade. And I thought this book was just so interesting and compelling, but that's because a lot of books are interesting and compelling, but it's such an interesting and compelling family dynamic. Just the coincidences of people meeting and crossing paths. It was just so fascinating to read, and I think that it's becoming a TV show, which I'm really excited for, even though I don't really watch TV. But I think this book gave me the vibes of like kind of like Homegoing by Yagyasi, but that with like kind of a Celeste Ng writing style, and then like with themes and plot elements from the book Passing by Nella Larson, like morally gray characters in the book. It does such a good job at criticizing and questioning the ideas of racial perception and communities based on race, and of course colorism and mother-daughter relationships. It's just so very good novel. Incredible storytelling. And I definitely need to check out BRIT Bennett's other book, The Mothers, as soon as I can. Actually, I should go put that book on hold from my library right now. Next book, Get a Life, Chloe Brown by Talia Hibbert. This book is a really, really, really cute romance, and I'm not a romance reader, but this was still pretty good, I think. It's like a meet cute between 2 characters who are both really sweet, but have their own like issues and their own past, and I give it 3 stars. I thought it was sweet. I thought it was cute. Romance is not really my genre. But I think if that's something that you're into, definitely read this book. It's been getting a lot of hype lately, and I totally get why. I don't know if I'm gonna read the second book in the series, Get a Life, Danny Brown. Maybe I will, if I need a light, like, pick-me-up. So the next book that I read was The Girl Who Drank the Moon by Kelly Barnhill, and I rated this book 3 stars. This was a really, really cute middle grade with fantasy magical elements, and, like, there's a magical forest, there's a witch, there's a town, and there's old people who are kind of evil. Yeah, I thought it was pretty good for a middle grade. I mean, middle grade is also just not really my genre either, which is why I didn't, like, rate this higher, but this has also been getting some hype in the book community, and I just wanted to check it out, and I wasn't disappointed, so yeah. And the next book that I read was Horror Store by Grady Hendrix. Also, I thought Grady Hendrix was a woman for, like, the longest time. But anyway, he's a dude, so. Horror Store was really good, I think. I mean, I am not a big reader of horror novels, mostly because I'm very easily spooked. But this book was not the kind of book that would, like, keep me up at night, but it was more of just a satire that criticized, like, corporate retail and capitalism and relationships that we have to each other under capitalism, and I thought it was so smart. I thought it was very witty, and I thought that the plot was very compelling and the characters were very memorable, and I really enjoyed it. 4 to 5 stars. And the last book that I read in the month of June, which I just finished last night, was Death in Her Hands by Ottessa Moshfegh, which I rated 3 stars. I think this is her being Ottessa Moshfegh's, like, weakest work that I've read so far. It was a really interesting meditation on, like, loneliness and isolation, and also from the perspective of, like, an old woman whom I don't really read the perspective of all the time, or that often, really. And I thought it was really interesting, and I think if you like dogs, you should read this book because she talks a lot about her pet dog and her relation to her pet dog. And I also think that the setting of this book was really pleasant, because it's like it's like a coastal kind of situation. Well, not really coastal. There's, like, a lake, and it's, like, a really rural area, and it's, like, this small town, very, like, all-American small town. I thought it was pretty good, but, like, didn't quite meet my expectations, if that makes sense. But I'm excited to get through the rest of Ottessa Moshfegh's work. That's everything that I read in the month of June. It was a pretty good reading month, but wasn't as many books as I wanted to read, so hopefully in July I can get more reading in. Yeah, let me know how your reading month was down in the comments, and that's all I have for you today, I guess. Bye!